The day my son tried to sell the business I spent my entire life building was the day everything inside me shifted. I remember sitting at the kitchen table, the same table where I used to balance the books late into the night when the business was just a dream, staring at the documents I'd found in his office. His name, my business name, and a price that felt like an insult, all scribbled on a contract ready to be signed. My hands trembled, not with fear but with something far more powerful. Heartbreak. I could hear the echoes of my younger self, hammering shelves together, sweeping sawdust off the floor, smiling the day I turned the sign that read "Open" for the very first time. Every early morning, every sacrifice, every moment I'd poured into that shop was flashing before my eyes. And here was my son, the boy I taught to count the register as a child, ready to throw it all away for a quick payout. I didn't shout. I didn't call him. Instead, I sat there in silence as the sun went down, and I realized I had to make a choice. Either let him destroy everything I'd worked for, or remind him what legacy truly means. He thought he had all the power, but what he didn't know was that I still had one last card to play, and when I used it, it would stop him cold and teach him a lesson he'd never forget. I was never a rich man, at least not by the world's standards. My wealth was measured in long hours, calloused hands, and a reputation for honesty that took decades to build. When I was young, I didn't have much, just an idea and a stubborn streak that refused to die. The business started as nothing, more than a rented corner space with peeling paint and a counter I built out of scrap wood. I remember those early days like they were yesterday, the way the bell over the door would jingle whenever a customer walked in, the way I'd greet every single one of them by name because back then, every sale mattered. There were nights when I slept in the back room, too tired to drive home, with invoices scattered around me and a half-finished cup of cold coffee on the desk. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. As the years passed, I poured everything I had into that little shop. Every extra dollar went back into the business, new equipment, better stock, a fresh coat of paint on the walls. People began to notice. They came not just for what we sold, but for the feeling of being known, of being welcomed like family. That's what I wanted most. A place that felt like home to the people who walked through the door. When Ethan was born, I used to bring him to the shop on Saturdays. He'd sit on the counter with a toy truck while I worked, waving at customers, as if he were the little mayor of the place. I'd let him help count the cash drawer at the end of the day, his small fingers pressing the calculator buttons while I told him how important it was to know where every penny went. Those moments became the rhythm of my life. The shop wasn't just a job. It was where I spent birthdays, anniversaries, even Christmas mornings sometimes when an order had to be filled. My wife understood. She'd bring Ethan by with a thermos of coffee and a plate of leftovers when I was working late. That's how we lived. A family stitched together by love and hard work, building something that we believed would outlast us. I used to think about the day I'd hand the keys over to Ethan and watch him carry on what we started. It wasn't just a dream. It was my motivation to keep going through every rough patch, every slow season, every time I wondered if we'd make it to the next month. Life tested us plenty of times. There were recessions that nearly broke us, competitors that tried to undercut us, weeks when I didn't know how I'd pay suppliers. But every challenge made me sharper, more determined. I learned how to negotiate, how to adapt, how to see opportunity where others saw dead ends. By the time Ethan was a teenager, the business was stable enough that he could see what all those years of sacrifice had built. I imagined him stepping into my shoes one day, not just running the shop but protecting its reputation, its heart. When he graduated from school, I started letting him take on more responsibility. At first, it was just handling suppliers, then managing staff schedules, then running the place for a few hours while I stepped away. I wanted him to feel the weight of it, the stress when a shipment was late, the satisfaction of a good sales day, the pride in helping a customer find exactly what they needed. For a while, I thought he understood. He had ideas about marketing, about expanding into online sales, and I welcomed them. He had a head for numbers, a quick mind that reminded me of my younger self. But over time, something began to shift. He grew restless, talking more about what we could get if we sold the business rather than what we could build with it. He'd mention friends of his who were investing in flashy startups or making fast money in real estate, and I could see the hunger in his eyes. It wasn't just ambition, it was impatience. He didn't want to wait for success to grow slowly, like I had. He wanted to leap ahead, to cash out and move on to something new. I tried to explain that this business wasn't just an asset on paper, it was history. It was the story of how we survived when we had nothing. The building itself carried memories. Every scuff on the floor told a story. The counter still had faint scratches from the time Ethan accidentally dragged a metal toy car across it when he was 6. The office walls were lined with photos. My first employee, our first delivery truck, a newspaper clipping from the day we won a local business award. This wasn't just a place of work, it was a museum of our lives. I'd walk through those aisles before opening every morning, taking a quiet moment to appreciate what we'd built, grateful that I still had the strength to do it. People in town knew me by name. They'd stop by even if they didn't need anything, just to talk. Some of my oldest customers had been coming for so long that I'd seen their children grow up. They'd tell me about their lives, and I'd tell them about mine. That was the kind of business I ran, not transactional, but personal. That's why the thought of it being sold to some stranger who didn't care about its soul felt like a punch to the gut. I thought I had more time to teach Ethan what all of this meant. I thought he'd learn by watching me, by seeing how much heart I put into every decision. I underestimated how tempting it would be to trade years of slow, steady growth for a quick windfall. Maybe I didn't talk enough about the nights I went without sleep or the years I went without taking a real vacation. Maybe I should have shown him more clearly that this business wasn't just about profit. It was about purpose. Even with those worries gnawing at me, I held on to hope. Every time we worked side by side, every time we solved a problem together, I believed that he'd eventually understand. I pictured him taking over fully one day, adding his own chapter to our story, and then passing it to his children. That dream carried me through more than he will ever know, and yet deep down there was a quiet fear I never voiced, that when the time came he might not want what I had to give, that he might see all of it, not as a gift, but as a burden he couldn't wait to shed. That fear grew louder the day I realized how close it was to becoming reality. It started with a single overheard conversation, the kind that makes your blood run cold. I was in the office late one evening, sorting through invoices and checking stock orders when I heard Ethan's voice from the hallway. He was on the phone, speaking in a hushed but excited tone, and the words that drifted into my ears made my chest tighten. He was talking numbers. Not sales numbers, not projections for the next quarter, but figures that sounded suspiciously like an offer. The name of a potential buyer slipped from his lips, and suddenly, it was as if the room around me had gone, silent except for the pounding of my own heartbeat. I sat there frozen, trying to convince myself I had misheard, that my son wasn't really negotiating to sell the very thing I had built with my own hands. For a few days I tried to push it from my mind, telling myself I would talk to him when the time was right, that this was just a passing thought he was entertaining. But then I found the papers. They were neatly tucked away in a folder on his desk, printed contracts and email correspondence with a buyer who was ready to move quickly. My hands trembled as I flipped through each page, reading the terms, the price, the signature lines already marked with his name. There was no mention of me anywhere, no space for my approval. It felt like I was being erased from my own story, like everything I had done was about to be signed away with the stroke of a pen. I wanted to confront him right there, to demand an explanation, but something stopped me. Maybe it was pride, maybe it was shock, maybe it was the fear of hearing the truth spoken out loud. Instead, I put the papers back exactly where I found them and sat at my desk for a long time after the lights had gone out, staring at nothing, trying to make sense of how we had gotten here. I thought about the times I had encouraged him to take initiative, to make decisions, to act like an owner. Had I unknowingly taught him that my opinion no longer mattered? The days that followed were tense in ways I can't even fully describe. Every time I looked at Ethan, I saw not just my son, but the man who was about to betray me, and he didn't even seem to notice. He would smile and chat about sales figures, future plans, and I would nod along while my stomach churned. The worst part wasn't the idea of losing the business. It was the idea of losing him. This wasn't just about money or control. This was about the bond between us, the unspoken agreement that everything I had done was for him. That one day he would honor that by carrying it forward. I started watching him more closely, noticing how distant he had become. He spent more time on the phone, more time out of the shop, more time avoiding eye contact when I asked him about his plans for the future. There was an eagerness in him, a barely contained excitement that should have made me proud but instead felt like a warning bell. He was in a hurry, rushing towards something I couldn't see, and I was powerless to slow him down. One evening I tried to bring it up gently. I asked him what he thought about the long-term future of the business. Whether he still saw himself running it in 5 or 10 years. He hesitated, then gave me a vague answer about keeping options open and exploring opportunities. It was the first time I saw guilt flicker across his face, just for a second, before he forced a smile and changed the subject. That tiny flash of guilt told me everything I needed to know. He was too far along to turn back on his own. The conflict inside me deepened with every passing day. Part of me wanted to stop him immediately, to put my foot down and remind him whose name was still tied to the business. Another part of me wanted to wait, to see if he would come to his senses on his own, to give him the chance to do the right thing before I stepped in. I was torn between anger and sadness, between wanting to protect what I had built and wanting to protect the relationship with my son. Then came the meeting. I didn't know about it until I saw him leave the shop early. One afternoon, dressed sharper than usual, a folder tucked under his arm. Something in me told me to follow him, so I did. I parked across the street and watched through the cafe window as he sat with a man I didn't recognize. Older, well-dressed, the kind of man who deals in contracts and closing costs. They shook hands, talked seriously, and I could see Ethan nodding eagerly as though every word was a promise of the future he wanted. My chest felt heavy as I sat there in my car, watching the boy I raised plan to hand away the thing that had defined our family for decades. That night, I couldn't sleep. I walked through the shop in the dark, my fingers brushing the shelves, the counters, the pictures on the wall. Each touch reminded me of the years I spent building this place, the nights I went without so my family wouldn't have to. I thought of my wife, long gone now, and what she would say if she saw us like this. Would she tell me to fight for what we built, or to let it go and hope our son would find his own way? I knew then that I couldn't simply stand by and watch. If I let him go through with this, the business would be gone, sold to someone who might strip it down, change everything, erase its soul. And worse, Ethan would carry on thinking that money was all that mattered, that a quick payout was worth more than legacy. That was something I couldn't allow. The conflict had moved beyond paperwork and contracts. It had become a battle for the heart of our family. The next morning, I started making calls of my own. Not to confront Ethan, not yet, but to quietly prepare. If he wanted to treat this like a business transaction, then I would too. Only I had decades more experience and a deeper understanding of what was at stake. I knew this was going to hurt him, maybe even make him angry enough to hate me for a while. But I was willing to carry that weight if it meant saving what we had built together. The days that followed were some of the hardest I can remember. I carried the knowledge of what Ethan was planning like a stone in my chest, heavy and impossible to ignore. Every time he walked through the door of the shop, every time I heard his voice on the phone, every time I saw his name on the daily reports, I felt the sting of what he was about to do. It wasn't just business anymore. It was personal, so deeply personal that even the air between us seemed charged with tension. I found myself looking at him differently, studying the way he moved, the way he spoke, searching for some sign that he might be hesitating, that he might still change his mind. But if anything, he looked more determined, more confident. There was a lightness in his step I hadn't seen in years, as if he could already feel the money in his hands. At night, when the shop was closed and the town had gone quiet, I would sit in the office and stare at the framed photos on the wall. There was one of Ethan when he was 7 years old, standing proudly in front of the store with a broom twice his height, smiling as if sweeping the front steps was the most important job in the world. I would trace my finger along the edge of that picture frame and wonder what had changed. When had that little boy who wanted to help his dad grow up into a man who wanted to sell away everything we had built? Somewhere along the way I had failed to pass on the sense of pride that had kept me going all these years. The thought gnawed at me until I could hardly stand it. What made it worse was how normal everything seemed on the surface. Customers still came in, orders still went out, the staff still laughed and talked as if nothing had changed. But for me, every sound was sharper. Every interaction felt like it could be the last. I started noticing details I had long since stopped paying attention to. The squeak of the old front door hinge, the way the morning light slanted across the floor, the faint smell of sawdust that never really left the air. These were the things that made the place feel alive to me, and soon they became painful reminders of what might soon be gone. I began to imagine what the shop would look like after the sale. The walls painted over, the familiar signs replaced, the faces of the employees I had come to think of as family replaced by strangers who didn't know a thing about our history. I pictured the counter being torn out, the shelves being rearranged, the very heart of the place being stripped bare. Each vision felt like a fresh betrayal, like I was losing the place one piece at a time before the sale even went through. The thought was unbearable, and yet I couldn't seem to stop torturing myself with it. My relationship with Ethan grew strained. Even though I said nothing to him about what I knew, he would talk casually about his plans for the future, dropping hints about new investments he wanted to make, trips he wanted to take. I would nod, forcing a smile, but inside I was boiling. There were moments when I came close to blurting everything out, to demanding that he stop, to reminding him whose sweat had gone into every beam and every brick of this place, but each time I bit my tongue. I told myself that if I spoke too soon, it would only push him further away. I needed to be careful, to be deliberate, to act in a way that would not just stop the sale but teach him why it mattered. Even my sleep was no longer my own. I would wake in the early hours of the morning, my heart pounding, my mind racing with worst-case scenarios. Sometimes I would go for long drives through the empty streets, circling past the shop just to see it standing, there lit by the dim glow of the streetlights. It comforted me to see it untouched, as if the building itself was holding its breath along with me, waiting to see what would happen next. One evening, just as I was locking up, Ethan came in unexpectedly. He had that same folder under his arm, the one I had seen before, and he looked almost triumphant. He told me casually that he had another meeting set for the end of the week, that things were moving faster than he expected. I kept my face neutral, nodded as though I was simply happy to hear that he was busy. But inside, I felt a quiet fury settle over me like a heavy coat. It was no longer a question of whether I should act. It was a question of when. The next day I met with my lawyer. Sitting across from her in that quiet office, I laid out everything. The ownership documents, the plans for succession I had drafted years ago, the trust arrangements I had never fully executed. She listened patiently, then told me what I needed to hear, that there was still time, that I still had the right to protect what was mine. The plan we came up with was simple, but ironclad, a way to make sure that no sale could go through without my signature, no matter what Ethan had promised anyone. As I signed the papers, I felt a strange mix of relief and sorrow. Relief because I knew I had taken the first step toward saving the business. Sorrow because I knew that sooner or later, Ethan would find out what I had done, and it would change everything between us. Walking out of that office, I looked up at the sky and felt the first hint of peace I had felt in weeks. I had done what needed to be done. The real storm was still coming, but at least now I had some control over what would happen when it hit. The days after I secured the papers felt eerily calm, like the world had paused for just a moment before everything came crashing down. On the surface, nothing had changed. Ethan still came in every morning, still greeted the employees, still moved through the shop with the same energy as before, but I carried a secret now, one that felt heavier with every passing hour. I knew that when the truth finally came out, there would be no going back. I told myself I was doing the right thing, that I was protecting something bigger than either of us, but there were moments, quiet moments late at night, when I questioned everything. Was I saving the business, or was I just too stubborn to let go? Was I protecting my son from a mistake, or was I punishing him for wanting a different life than the one I had imagined for him? Each interaction between us became more loaded, as if there was a conversation happening beneath the words we actually spoke. He would ask about the books or a new shipment, and I would answer. But my mind would wander to the contract I had blocked and the confrontation that was surely coming. I started to notice small cracks in his confidence. There were times he would look at me a beat too long, as if wondering what I was thinking, as if sensing that I was no longer just the quiet, supportive father standing in the background. I could see the tension building between us, invisible but undeniable, like storm clouds on the horizon. When the day of his next meeting arrived, I felt my heart race the moment he left the shop. I knew that by the time he returned, the deal would be dead, the buyer already informed that no transaction could take place without my consent. I imagined the scene, Ethan sitting across from the buyer, expecting to shake hands and move forward, only to be told that the deal was impossible. I imagined the flash of anger on his face, the humiliation of realizing that he had been outmaneuvered by his own father. Part of me felt guilty for putting him in that position, but another part of me knew it was the only way to make him understand the gravity of what he was trying to do. When he came back that afternoon, I could see it immediately. The tightness in his jaw, the clipped way he set down his keys, the folder he dropped on the counter a little harder than he needed to. He didn't speak to me right away. Instead, he busied himself with meaningless tasks, checking stock that didn't need to be checked, counting the register even though we hadn't closed yet. Finally, he turned to me and asked if I had known anything about the changes to the business documents. His voice was level, but there was an edge beneath it, sharp enough to cut. I met his eyes and told him the truth. Yes, I had made the changes. Yes, I had done it to stop the sale, and yes, I would do it again if I had to. For a moment, I thought he might shout, but instead he went very still. The silence between us stretched until it felt unbearable. Then, in a voice that was quieter than I expected, he asked me why. It was the first real question he had asked me in months, and it caught me off guard. I told him everything. About the nights I had worked until my body ached. About the times I nearly lost everything but held on anyway. About how I had dreamed of passing this place down to him not as a piece of property but as a piece of our history. I told him that the business was never just about money to me, that selling it without a thought for what it meant to our family would have been like selling our name, our story, our sacrifices. As I spoke, I saw something in his face shift. The anger didn't vanish, but it softened just slightly, replaced by something that looked like pain. He didn't argue right away. He didn't storm out or throw accusations. He just stood there, staring at the floor, as if everything I had said was sinking in one piece at a time. For the first time in weeks, we were quiet together, not with avoidance or resentment, but with something heavier, more honest. Later that night, I sat alone in the shop after he had gone home, turning over the day's events in my mind. Knew this wasn't over. I knew there were still harsh words to be spoken and decisions to be made. But for the first time, I felt like maybe, just maybe, there was a chance that Ethan could see what I saw when I looked at this place. Maybe he could feel the weight of its history, the responsibility that came with holding its future in his hands. The thought gave me hope, fragile, but real. Even so, the emotional toll was undeniable. My chest felt heavy, my body exhausted, as though I had run a marathon without leaving the office. This wasn't the kind of fight I had ever imagined having with my son, but it was the one we needed. There was no way to shield him from the hard lesson ahead, no way to soften the truth. In a strange way, I realized that this was exactly what I had been preparing him for all along, to face the hard decisions, to understand what it means to bear the weight of something worth protecting. The question that lingered in my mind as I finally locked up for the night was whether he would rise to meet that challenge or walk away from it completely. The turning point came sooner than I expected. 2 mornings later, Ethan walked into the shop before opening hours, a rare occurrence since he usually arrived just as the first customers came through the door. He didn't say a word at first. He simply set his phone down on the counter and slid it toward me. On the screen was an email from the buyer, short, blunt, and final, stating that due to ownership complications, they were withdrawing their offer. I looked up and saw him watching me, his face unreadable. The silence between us stretched until it felt like the entire room was holding its breath. For a moment, I thought this was the explosion I had been bracing for, the moment he would finally let his anger boil over and say all the things he had been holding back. But instead of shouting, he asked me the question I had both feared and hoped for. Why did you do it? His voice wasn't angry now. It was tired, quiet, like someone who had been carrying too much weight for too long. I stood there staring at him and realized this was my chance. Not to scold him, not to lecture him, but to finally tell him the truth that I had been carrying in my chest for decades. I told him about the nights I had slept in the back room when I couldn't afford to close, about the winters I had gone without heat at home because I had to pay suppliers first, about the early mornings when I would look at the ledger and wonder how we would survive another month. I told him about the pride I felt when we made it through those hard years, when I was finally able to hire our first employee, when I watched the business grow into something that supported not just us but other families too. Every story came out of me like a flood, each one a piece of the history I had assumed he already understood. He didn't interrupt me. He didn't look away. For the first time in months, he just listened. When I told him that the business was never just about making money, that it was about providing a place where people felt known, where they were more than just customers, I saw his jaw tighten. When I said that selling it without thought would have felt like selling a piece of myself, I saw his eyes drop to the floor. And when I told him that I had made the legal changes not to punish him, but to give him time to really think about what he was doing, I saw the fight drain out of his shoulders. It was then that he spoke, and for the first time I heard his side of the story. He told me that he hadn't wanted to hurt me, that he had been worried about the future of the business in a changing world. He said that some of his friends had warned him about how hard it was to keep a small independent shop alive when bigger companies were swallowing everything. Selling had felt like a way to secure his financial future before things got worse. He admitted he had been scared that he wouldn't be able to live up to what I had built, scared that he might be the one to watch it all fall apart. Hearing those words changed something in me. For weeks I had been telling myself that Ethan's decision came from selfishness, from greed, from a lack of respect. But now, listening to him, I realized it came from fear. He wasn't trying to throw away what I had built. He was trying to protect himself from the possibility of failure. That fear was something I understood all too well. I had felt it every time I signed a loan, every time I gambled on a new product, every time I put my name on something that could have cost me everything. I just hadn't realized how much of that fear I had passed on to him without ever teaching him how to bear it. The air between us shifted in that moment. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was understanding. A fragile bridge built between two people who had been standing on opposite sides for far too long. I told him that fear was part of the job, that it had always been part of the job, and that the real measure of a person wasn't whether they felt fear but whether they faced it. I said that if he truly wanted to carry on what we had built, he had to learn to sit with that fear, to make decisions that honored more than just the bottom line. For a moment I thought he might shout, but instead he went very still. The silence between us stretched until it felt unbearable. Then, in a voice that was quieter than I expected, he asked me why. It was the first real question he had asked me in months, and it caught me off guard. I told him everything. About the nights I had worked until my body ached. About the times I nearly lost everything but held on anyway. About how I had dreamed of passing this place down to him not as a piece of property but as a piece of our history. I told him that the business was never just about money to me, that selling it without a thought for what it meant to our family would have been like selling our name, our story, our sacrifices. As I spoke, I saw something in his face shift. The anger didn't vanish, but it softened just slightly, replaced by something that looked like pain. He didn't argue right away. He didn't storm out or throw accusations. He just stood there, staring at the floor, as if everything I had said was sinking in one piece at a time. For the first time in weeks, we were quiet together, not with avoidance or resentment, but with something heavier, more honest. Later that night, I sat alone in the shop after he had gone home, turning over the day's events in my mind. Knew this wasn't over. I knew there were still harsh words to be spoken and decisions to be made. But for the first time, I felt like maybe, just maybe, there was a chance that Ethan could see what I saw when I looked at this place. Maybe he could feel the weight of its history, the responsibility that came with holding its future in his hands. The thought gave me hope. Fragile, but real. Even so, the emotional toll was undeniable. My chest felt heavy, my body exhausted, as though I had run a marathon without leaving the office. This wasn't the kind of fight I had ever imagined having with my son, but it was the one we needed. There was no way to shield him from the hard lesson ahead, no way to soften the truth. In a strange way, I realized that this was exactly what I had been preparing him for all along, to face the hard decisions, to understand what it means to bear the weight of something worth protecting. The question that lingered in my mind as I finally locked up for the night was whether he would rise to meet that challenge or walk away from it completely. The turning point came sooner than I expected. 2 mornings later, Ethan walked into the shop before opening hours, a rare occurrence since he usually arrived just as the first customers came through the door. He didn't say a word at first. He simply set his phone down on the counter and slid it toward me. On the screen was an email from the buyer, short, blunt, and final, stating that due to ownership complications, they were withdrawing their offer. I looked up and saw him watching me, his face unreadable. The silence between us stretched until it felt like the entire room was holding its breath. For a moment, I thought this was the explosion I had been bracing for, the moment he would finally let his anger boil over and say all the things he had been holding back. But instead of shouting, he asked me the question I had both feared and hoped for. Why did you do it? His voice wasn't angry now. It was tired, quiet, like someone who had been carrying too much weight for too long. I stood there staring at him and realized this was my chance. Not to scold him, not to lecture him, but to finally tell him the truth that I had been carrying in my chest for decades. I told him about the nights I had slept in the back room when I couldn't afford to close, about the winters I had gone without heat at home because I had to pay suppliers first, about the early mornings when I would look at the ledger and wonder how we would survive another month. I told him about the pride I felt when we made it through those hard years, when I was finally able to hire our first employee, when I watched the business grow into something that supported not just us but other families too. Every story came out of me like a flood, each one a piece of the history I had assumed he already understood. He didn't interrupt me. He didn't look away. For the first time in months, he just listened. When I told him that the business was never just about making money, that it was about providing a place where people felt known, where they were more than just customers, I saw his jaw tighten. When I said that selling it without thought would have felt like selling a piece of myself, I saw his eyes drop to the floor. And when I told him that I had made the legal changes not to punish him, but to give him time to really think about what he was doing, I saw the fight drain out of his shoulders. It was then that he spoke, and for the first time I heard his side of the story. He told me that he hadn't wanted to hurt me, that he had been worried about the future of the business in a changing world. He said that some of his friends had warned him about how hard it was to keep a small independent shop alive when bigger companies were swallowing everything. Selling had felt like a way to secure his financial future before things got worse. He admitted he had been scared that he wouldn't be able to live up to what I had built, scared that he might be the one to watch it all fall apart. Hearing those words changed something in me. For weeks I had been telling myself that Ethan's decision came from selfishness, from greed, from a lack of respect. But now, listening to him, I realized it came from fear. He wasn't trying to throw away what I had built. He was trying to protect himself from the possibility of failure. That fear was something I understood all too well. I had felt it every time I signed a loan, every time I gambled on a new product, every time I put my name on something that could have cost me everything. I just hadn't realized how much of that fear I had passed on to him without ever teaching him how to bear it. The air between us shifted in that moment. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was understanding. A fragile bridge built between two people who had been standing on opposite sides for far too long. I told him that fear was part of the job, that it had always been part of the job, and that the real measure of a person wasn't whether they felt fear but whether they faced it. I said that if he truly wanted to carry on what we had built, he had to learn to sit with that fear, to make decisions that honored more than just the bottom line. He nodded slowly, and for the first time I saw him not just as my son, but as a man standing at a crossroads. He wasn't the little boy on the counter anymore, nor was he the impatient young man ready to sell everything for a quick win. He was someone trying to figure out who he wanted to be, someone who still had a chance to grow into the kind of person I had always hoped he would become. When we finally opened the doors that morning, something was different between us. The customers came in as usual, the bell over the door chimed, the shelves needed restocking. But I noticed Ethan watching everything more closely. He greeted people by name again, something he hadn't done in months. He lingered longer with an older customer who had come in just to talk, asking about her family, listening with real interest. I stood back and let him have that moment, feeling a quiet pride swell in my chest. That night as we closed up, he turned to me and said something I will never forget. "I don't know if I can be you," he said softly, "but I want to try." There was no arrogance in his tone now, no rush, no hunger for escape, just a quiet determination. I told him he didn't have to be me. He just had to care enough to keep the heart of the place alive. He nodded again, and in that moment I knew that the fight I had been waging wasn't for nothing. The revelation wasn't just his. It was mine too. I had spent so much time trying to control the future of the business that I had forgotten the most important thing. I wasn't just leaving him a shop, I was leaving him a chance to write his own chapter. My job wasn't to make him do it my way, but to make sure he understood why it mattered. That day, for the first time, I believed he did. The real test came a week later when the buyer returned with a final offer, this time in person. I hadn't expected him to come back after walking away, but he showed up at the shop one afternoon, briefcase in hand, determined to convince Ethan to push back against me and close the deal anyway. I was in the office when Ethan came to get me, his expression tight but calm. "He's here," he said simply, and for a moment I could see the battle playing out in his mind. This was his chance to side with the buyer, to force a confrontation, to prove that he could still take control. Instead, he asked me to join them. The three of us sat at the counter, the buyer laying out his proposal once more, this time offering a higher figure, sweetening the deal to make it harder to refuse. He spoke with smooth confidence, painting pictures of what Ethan could do with the money: investments, expansion, freedom from the stress of day-to-day operations. It was tempting, I won't deny it. The number on the paper was larger than anything I had ever seen attached to this business. For a moment, I let myself imagine what it would feel like to sign, to walk away with pockets full and never have to worry about inventory or payroll again. But then I looked around the shop. The shelves lined with products I had chosen carefully, the counters I had sanded by hand, the framed photos that told the story of our journey. I thought about the customers who had come to rely on us, the employees whose families depended on those paychecks. I saw Ethan sitting next to me, his jaw tight, his hands clasped together on the counter. I knew that if I said yes, he would follow my lead, and that he would regret it for the rest of his life. The buyer pressed on, growing bolder, trying to play us against each other. He hinted that if I refused, Ethan could still find a way to challenge my decision, that the process might be messy but not impossible. It was a thinly veiled threat, and I saw Ethan flinch. That was when I decided it was time to end this. I leaned forward, my voice calm but unshakable, and told the man that there would be no sale, not now, not ever. The business was staying, in the family, and the decision was final. There was a moment of stunned silence. The buyer's smile faltered, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of frustration cross his polished face. He tried one last time to persuade Ethan directly, but Ethan surprised both of us. He shook his head and said that he agreed with me, that he had been wrong to try to sell without thinking about what it meant. His voice was steady, and there was a weight to his words that made me proud. "This place isn't just numbers on a page," he said. "It's who we are." The buyer realized he was beaten. He closed his briefcase with a sharp click, muttered something about wasted time, and left without another word. The door closed behind him, leaving the shop unusually quiet. I turned to look at Ethan, expecting him to be angry with me for cornering him into this decision, but instead he let out a long breath and almost smiled. It wasn't a smile of joy exactly, more like relief, like a man who had finally put down a weight he didn't know he was carrying. That moment felt like the true climax, not just of this conflict but of everything we had been through. All the silent nights, all the tension, all the fear and disappointment had led to this. A father and son finally standing on the same side, choosing not money, not convenience, but meaning. It didn't erase the hurt of the past weeks, but it was the first step towards something better. Later that evening, after the employees had gone home and the shop was quiet again, Ethan stayed behind. He asked me to show him some of the things he had never really paid attention to before. The old inventory ledgers, the maintenance schedules, the network of suppliers I had spent years cultivating. We stayed there for hours, going through the details, talking honestly about the challenges ahead. For the first time, I didn't feel like I was fighting to keep him from taking something from me. I felt like I was passing something to him carefully, piece by piece, trusting that he was finally ready to carry it. When we finally locked up and stepped outside, the sky was clear, the stars scattered above us like pinpricks of light. Ethan turned to me and said quietly, "I get it now." It was just 3 words, but they were enough. I could hear the truth in them, feel the shift in his heart. He wasn't the same young man who had tried to sell the business behind my back. He was someone new, someone who understood the weight of what he held and was willing to bear it. As we stood there under the night sky, I felt something inside me let go. Not the business, not the responsibility, but the fear that I had carried for so long. The fear that my son would never understand, that everything I had done would be for nothing. In that moment, I knew we had turned a corner. Whatever came next, we would face it together. The resolution wasn't dramatic. There was no grand gesture, no sudden transformation. It was a quiet, steady rebuilding of trust, day by day. That was how it had always been with this business. One careful step after another, building something that lasted. And just like the business itself, our relationship began to feel stronger, sturdier, able to weather whatever storms might come next. One Sunday afternoon, I found myself sitting alone in the shop after closing, the sun slanting through the windows and casting long shadows across the floor. I looked around at everything, the shelves, the counter, the old clock on the wall, and felt a wave of gratitude wash over me, not just for the business, but for the journey that had brought us here. The betrayal, the anger, the heartbreak, all of it had led to something better. Ethan hadn't just learned a lesson, so had I. I had learned that holding on too tightly can be as dangerous as letting go too easily. That part of leaving a legacy is trusting the next person to write the rest of the story. When Ethan came back later that evening to grab some paperwork, I told him that I was proud of him. Not just for choosing to keep the business, but for choosing to grow into the kind of man who could carry it forward. He smiled. Not the eager, impatient smile I had seen before, but a softer one, full of understanding. "I won't let you down," he said simply. And for the first time, I believed him completely. As we locked up and walked out together, I glanced back at the shop one last time before turning off the lights. It didn't just feel like a place of work anymore. It felt like a promise that what had been built with so much care and sacrifice would continue. Not because I forced it to, but because Ethan chose it. The weight I had been carrying for years was gone, replaced by something lighter, hope. And that, more than anything, was the legacy I wanted to leave behind. If you've ever been in a situation where family and business collided, you know how painful those choices can be. What would you have done if you were in my shoes? Would you have fought to keep the business in the family, or would you have let your son make his own mistakes and sell it? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Share them in the comments below. Your perspective might help someone else going through the same struggle right now. If this story resonated with you, take a second to like this video and subscribe to the channel. We share powerful, true-to-life stories like this every week, stories about family, forgiveness, and finding strength when it matters most. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss the next one. And if you've ever had to stand up for something you believe in, no matter the cost, tell us about it. These conversations remind us we're not alone, and they help build a community of people who know what it means to fight for what really matters. Your story could inspire someone else to find the courage to do the same. This isn't just about one man and his business, it's about every family who's ever faced a tough decision about their future. So drop a comment, share this video with someone who needs to see it, and stay tuned. The next story we're sharing is one you won't want to miss. It's about a grandfather who was betrayed by his own family, and the way he turned the tables will leave you speechless.